Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Tom Alves, I'm the Head of Development at AHURI, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this latest in our AHURI Research webinar series. I want to begin today by acknowledging that I am hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work and are joining us from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to lands and waters throughout Australia. AHURI is pleased to be able to offer this research webinar series as a means of keeping you informed of our latest research and to help you to engage with the findings from our ongoing program of research. Especially important at a time when we're somewhat more restricted in our ability to meet together in person. Today will be the 12th installment in our webinar series. So if you're interested in catching up on previous webinars that you may not have been able to attend, these recordings are all freely available on our website. AHURI created the AHURI COVID-19 Research Hub back in March as a platform to host relevant news and our own analysis of key policy decisions relating to housing, homelessness and cities in response to this pandemic. We also commissioned the COVID-19 Research Agenda, 8 rapid research projects to answer some of the most pressing policy questions. Our 7th final report from this research agenda has just been published. The report is called Marginal Housing During COVID-19, and it looked at the impact of the pandemic on marginal and informal housing and short-term rental accommodation to establish any health or housing risks. It also investigated the changes in the supply and demand of informal housing during COVID-19. Please do visit the Hub to see this report and the other reports and an array of other interesting content that relates to COVID-19. Okay, before I introduce today's topic and speakers, I need firstly to provide you with a few instructions about the software that we're using and also to do a bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded. If you want to return to it later or if you want to forward it to a colleague, you can do so. It will be available on the AHURI website shortly after today's presentation. At the end of the webinar, you will receive a survey. You're welcome to give feedback. In fact, we strongly welcome your feedback so that we can continue to refine and improve our webinar offerings to you. In terms of participating in today's webinar, here are some instructions for you. So you're listening in using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join in over your telephone, you just need to select telephone under the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed there and you can dial in. You will have the opportunity to submit questions today, and you do that by typing them into the questions part of the control panel. Please submit your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll do our best afterwards during our Q&A session to address those. There's also a raise your hand function as part of the software, but please disregard this. We won't be using that today. Now to today's topic and presenters. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar, which is called Reforming Rental Subsidies to Support Low-Income Households. Our presenter today is Professor Rachel Ong ViforJ from Curtin University in Western Australia. Rachel is the lead author of AHURI's report, Reforming Rental Subsidies to Support Low-Income Households, which examines possible cost-effective reforms to Commonwealth rent assistance and whether these could improve housing outcomes for low-income renters. The full report, along with a policy evidence summary and the standalone executive summary, are all now available on AHURI's website. And these documents are also available to you during the webinar through the handouts section of your control panel if you want to have a look through them at the moment while we're doing the presentation. Rachel Ong ViforJ is a Professor of Economics and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow at Curtin University. Rachel's research interests include housing wealth inequality, intergenerational housing concerns, housing pathways, housing affordability dynamics, and the links between housing and non-shelter outcomes. Also to the webinar today, we welcome Adrian Pisarski. He will be a respondent to the presentation following Rachel's presentation. Adrian is the Executive Officer of National Shelter. He has a 40-year history in the community sector, including roles with housing, homelessness, welfare and youth peak bodies in Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland and nationally. Probably know where you haven't worked by the sound of it, Adrian. He's been the Executive Officer of Queensland Shelter between 2002 and 2013. He was the Chairperson of National Shelter between 2004 and 2013, and he is currently, as I said, the Executive Officer of National Shelter. So the format for today's webinar will include a short industry response from Adrian following Rachel's research presentation. And after that, I will facilitate a discussion with our two participants taking your questions, which again, I remind you to type in to the questions pane at any time during the presentation today. So with no further ado, it's now my great pleasure to hand over to Rachel to present her research. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Tom. It's great to be here to be able to present on this project. As Tom has alluded to, the project was principally trying to look at whether we would be able to come up with some reforms to the design of rental subsidies in Australia that might better support low-income private rental households. So I'm going to start by just talking a bit about how the research was conducted. So if you could, next slide, please. In terms of how it was conducted, I'll say a little bit about the contributors, because obviously, though I am the face of the project today, there's been a team of experts, housing experts who have contributed to the project. And I'll talk a little bit about the approach as well, because it was a multi-stage approach that we took. Next slide, please. So here's the list of contributors. Apart from myself, the other authors who contributed to the project and the report are Professor Hal Paulson and Dr. Chris Martin from UNSW. They brought along, international housing policy expertise, and that was really invaluable in the contribution to the project. Dr. Chris Martin brought along his legal background as well, and as you'll see later, I'll talk a little bit about constitutional challenges to the reform of CRA. Another author was Dr. Ranjot Singh from Curtin University, who worked closely with me on the modeling aspects of the project. We had two senior advisors on the project, Associate Professor Vivian Milligan from UNSW and Professor Mark Harris from Curtin. And you'll see that there's a list of policy organizations that I've listed on the slide as well, because part of the project actually involved an engagement workshop with policymakers in order to get policy input into the sort of reforms that we might model in relation to rental subsidies in Australia. So as you'll see on the list, we did have the Department of Social Services at the federal level and various state departments as well. Next slide, please. So this diagram attempts to give an overview of the approach that we took. We started off with an international literature and policy review. This was led by Professor Hal Paulson and Dr. Chris Martin. And obviously there was a project timeframe that we were working with, and so we had to pick a selected number of countries to review. So we looked at New Zealand, UK, US, Ireland, and Germany. These are countries with, reasonable sized private rental sectors. And we took a look at their rent assistance systems for low-income private renters in these countries. We looked at the programs that they had, who they were paid to, the entitlements, and whether there was regulation as well in the sector. Once that review was finished, we took those review findings to a policy engagement workshop. And as you still recall in the previous slide, I did list the organizations that were involved as well. So we had a number of a group of policymakers and also housing researchers really sitting around the table, giving us input as to the sort of reform options we might model. Some of these might be drawn a little bit from international examples, but there were obviously examples as well from Australia. We've had lots of proposals come out over the years in relation to Commonwealth rent assistance for low-income private renters. These were discussed in detail in the workshop as well. From the workshop, we narrowed down the range of options that were recommended to 3 CRA reforms, which the team then went away to model these reforms and to evaluate the impacts of these reforms from the perspectives of adequacy, as in like the extent to which the reforms might lift low-income private renters out of housing stress, targeting accuracy. Is the current CRA system actually targeting the group that is most in need, or is CRA actually, being paid to some groups that don't necessarily need them? Are groups that need CRA missing out? We did try to model reforms to see whether we can better target CRA. So that's targeting accuracy. We were also interested in how much the reforms would cost. So we did a budgetary analysis as well, and I'll present the findings on that shortly. There's just a couple more points that I'll mention here, which is that the policy simulations were run on the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey from the year 2017. This is a nationally representative survey, and there's about 13,000 respondents in there. Of course, we narrowed down our focus to low-income private renters. The year 2017 was chosen because that was the latest year of the data set that was available at the time that we ran the project. If you'll look on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that there's also a component which I call econometric modeling. Really what that modeling was attempting to do was to look at the extent to which increasing CRA might actually lead to what we call capitalization effects, which means if we were to increase CRA, might some of that actually be absorbed in higher market rents? That is actually quite a common concern that is often raised in relation to demand-side subsidies, such as Commonwealth rent assistance, the first homeowners grant, for instance. There's always some concern that it might actually push up housing costs as a result. Next slide. Thank you. Just a bit of background on Australia's Commonwealth rent assistance system within the international context. So our Commonwealth rent assistance system, which is what's available, the main rental assistance system that's available to low-income private renters, is quite distinctive in comparison to the other countries that we reviewed. And this one slide really does not do justice to the depth of detail that we have in our international review that can actually be found in the report, but I'm quite constrained in terms of time here. So I've just basically listed some of the key features of our Commonwealth rent assistance system. It's restricted to income support recipients. It's paid to renters, not the landlords. So for instance, in Ireland, we have housing assistance payment, which is actually paid to landlords. So in some other countries, it is paid to landlords, not renters, but over here in Australia, we pay it to our renters. It's capped at maximum rates. It's regionally invariant, which is actually turned out to be quite a distinctive feature of our system, because in countries like Germany, there are regional variations allowed in the level of payments. Countries like Ireland, New Zealand, United Kingdom as well, they do allow regional variations in the rent assistance that they pay to low-income tenants, and it's not rationed. So we have a combination of all these features in our Commonwealth rent assistance system. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about the CRA reforms that we actually designed, and just to recap, the reform designs were we settled on these 3 reforms after discussing this with policy attendees at the AHURI policy engagement workshop that the team participated in. But before I talk about the three designs, I'll just quickly talk about the existing CRA design, which I'm sure most, if not all of us, would be quite familiar with. So it is paid to private renters, and CRA is actually attached to an income support payment. So to be eligible for CRA, one must first be in receipt of an income support payment. For single private renters, you must be generally in receipt of a pension or an allowance. If you have children, then you go through the family tax benefit system, and you must be receiving more than the base rate of family tax benefit Part A to be eligible for Commonwealth rent assistance. But that's only one of the eligibility criteria. There's also rent criteria as well. So rents must exceed a minimum rent threshold, and these thresholds actually differ depending on your household type. So if I'm a private renter and I pay a rent level that's exceeding the minimum rent threshold that applies to my household type, then I start receiving CRA, and that's paid at 75 cents per dollar of rent above that threshold. And the final point to note is that the maximum CRA rate is capped. So when it gets up to a certain level, it won't increase any further, even if rents continue to increase. Now let's just talk about the three reforms. The next slide, please. Yeah. Reform 1 that we model was to basically raise the Commonwealth rent assistance maximum rate by 30%. So this is actually quite a familiar reform design, in the sense that various organizations have actually over a number of years called for raising the CRA maximum rate. And that's not surprising, because it's a clear fact that the CRA maximum rate has not risen at the same pace as rents over a period of time. So the maximum rate that low-income private renters get paid has actually lagged quite a bit behind rent increases. And of course, you'd expect, therefore, then CRA to become less and less adequate over time. So some organizations have proposed increasing the CRA rate by 30%, others by 40%. Some suggest raising the CRA rate in conjunction with increasing the rate of, say, job seeker allowance. So there's been various variants that have been proposed. We model simply what would happen if we were to increase the CRA maximum rate by 30%. The second one is a little bit more intricate. It targets the minimum rent threshold part of the CRA reform design. Okay, Reform 1 targets the maximum rate component. Reform 2 targets the minimum rent threshold component. What we basically found, and other studies have found as well, is that income units or households without children typically experience higher levels of housing stress than families with children. So we looked at resetting the rent threshold so as to address this issue of just a difference in the levels of housing stress that are being faced by different household types. So what we did was, operationally, we dropped the minimum rent thresholds for people with for households with no children, and we raised the minimum rent thresholds for households with children. And we wanted to see whether or not this would actually assist in terms of lifting more households with no children out of housing stress, but also whether it would make CRA better targeted in its assistance to those who need CRA. The third reform was all about decoupling the CRA system from the general income support system, so that it simply reflects housing need, which we define as renters paying more than 30% of their income in rents. And of course, I understand that that's just one out of many benchmarks that we could have modeled, but that's the one that we chose within the short time frame that we had. Now with Reform 3, you basically just change your eligibility criteria. It would be fully eligibility for CRA will be fully dependent on housing need, rather than whether or not you are in receipt of an income support payment. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just want to provide what I'm calling the baseline scenario. It's just looking at how the current CRA system works or doesn't work for low-income private renters. It just provides a baseline scenario for us to compare the reform outcomes against. Next slide, please. So firstly, in terms of coverage, there's about 1.4 million low-income private renter income units. In Australia, income units are similar to households. So there's about 1.4 million of them, and of these, about 933,000 are assisted by CRA. So it does cover quite a significant proportion of low-income private renter households. Now, in terms of adequacy for those who receive it, I've got a table there that gives different housing stress benchmarks. So 30% is if you're paying more than 30% of your income in your rent, 40% if you're paying more than 40% of your income in rent, and so on. And I've got two columns there comparing low-income CRA recipients' shares in housing stress without and with CRA. Okay, so just to explain in that first row, what I'm saying there is that about 64.6% of low-income CRA recipients would be in housing stress, according to the 30% benchmark, if they didn't have CRA. Okay, now if they did have CRA, about 33.9% would remain in housing stress. So if you compare the two numbers, you'll see that the existence of CRA actually reduces the share of low-income CRA recipients in housing stress from 64.6% to 33.9%. So that's about it's about a 50% drop. However, it still remains the fact that 1/3, which is 33.9% of low-income CRA recipients, are still in housing stress. They get CRA and they still find themselves in housing stress. That creates quite a bit of problem and concern from the perspective of adequacy. Next slide, please. Okay, so targeting accuracy. If you look at the current CRA system, the headline finding basically where targeting is concerned is that the CRA targeting error amongst low-income private renters is quite high at 41%. Okay, so it can be actually broken down into this pie chart that I've got up here. And from now on, I'm simply going to use the term housing stress, but it's actually defined as people paying more than 30% of their income in housing costs. If you look at the dark blue and the light blue slices of the pie chart, these are the segments of the low-income private renter group that have been accurately targeted by CRA. So 16% of low-income private renters are not in housing stress and they don't receive CRA. So we say that they've been accurately targeted because they're not in housing stress, so they don't get CRA. 43%, and that's the biggest chunk, are in housing stress and they do receive CRA, so that's good. But then there's also the red chunks as well, which are quite big in size as well. So 23% of low-income private renters are not in housing stress, and yet they receive Commonwealth rent assistance. 18% of low-income private renters are in fact in housing stress, and yet they miss out on Commonwealth rent assistance. If you add the 23 and the 18, you get 41%. Next slide, please. So I just want to quickly talk about the profile of what I'm calling the target error group. So these are the two chunks that were represented in light and dark red in my previous slide. Amongst those who are in housing stress but don't receive CRA, they're more likely to be single people with no children. In fact, 85% of this group are single people with no children. They tend to be younger, lower income workers and living in cities like Sydney and Melbourne. Okay, where rental costs tend to be higher than the rest of Australia. Then you have this other group, which is quite big as well, which would be the 23% or so of low-income private renters who are actually not in housing stress, but they receive CRA. These are more likely to be families with children, but couples with children, also parents, middle age, and living in regional areas. Next slide, please. I'm going to now talk about the reform simulation findings and how they stack up against the baseline scenario. Next slide, please. So firstly, from the perspective of adequacy, this table tries to show the numbers of low-income private renters who are actually lifted out of housing stress as a result of the reforms. So we've got, for instance, in the first row, this 848,500 low-income private rental units that are in housing stress under the current system. And then as you move from left to right, you'll see that that number actually drops to 506,000 under Reform 1, which was raising the maximum CRA rate, 544,000 under Reform 2, which was changing the minimum rent threshold, and finally to 477,000 under the third reform, which was just changing the CRA eligibility criteria to reflect housing need. And if you go down to the second row, it just follows the same trend. Okay, all the reforms have a positive impact from the perspective of adequacy, because you'll see that the incidence of housing stress drops drastically. But the sharpest drop comes under Reform 3, which is when you change eligibility criteria for CRA to reflect housing need. In fact, if you just jump right down to the last row, you'll see that 43.7% of low-income private renters are lifted out of housing stress by CRA reform. Now, of course, that's nowhere near 100% being lifted out. It is the most effective one amongst the three reforms. Next slide, please. The targeting accuracy as well, and really the top table shows, the main thing that the top table shows is that under Reform 3, the target area for CRA will reduce right down to 0. This is because of the formula we use. We said you're in housing stress if you pay more than 30% of your income in housing costs. And so if we were to change CRA's eligibility criteria so they're only paid to people in housing stress, then targeting error actually drops right down to 0. And in the bottom table, which is about a target accurate groups, you can see that targeting accuracy actually slowly improves as well as you move from the actual scenario on the left to the right, and targeting accuracy is the highest under Reform 3. Okay, so targeting error falls under each of the reforms, targeting accuracy increases, but again, the most effective one appears to be Reform 3 from this slide. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier before, we were interested in what the cost of the reforms would be. All my previous slides have been about low-income private renters because that's the group that's most in need, and that's also the group that we've been most interested in. But when we did the budget calculations, we actually looked at what the cost would be if we were to apply it to all CRA recipients, not just the low-income ones. So government spending on CRA stands at around $4.5 billion, which you can see under that actual column. And if you go from left to right, you'll see that Reform 1 is going to cost an additional $1 billion. It'll take us up to about $5.6 billion. That's to be expected because Reform 1 was about increasing the maximum CRA rate by 30%. So that would basically increase the amount of expenditure on CRA as a whole. Under Reform 2, which was about changing the minimum rent thresholds to improve targeting accuracy, the cost would stay roughly the same because you basically reduce CRA for certain groups and increase it for other groups. And then under Reform 3, the cost of CRA would actually drop from $4.5 billion to $3.4 billion. And there'd actually be a saving of $1.2 billion. The Reform 3 is, I suppose, in a way, the most drastic reform. You're not just tweaking with existing CRA parameters, you are changing the eligibility criteria for CRA. It does bring some savings because you shift the composition of CRA recipients, and it does create a scenario where some groups will lose their CRA payments while others will gain. So next slide, please. So there are some challenges to CRA reform because all these modeling that we've done obviously show that there will be some benefits to reform, but as usual, there are challenges to consider. Next slide, please. So a key set of challenges would come in a form of constitutional challenges, and this is in relation to Reform 3, which was about changing the eligibility criteria for CRA to reform housing need. So at the moment, the Australian government is constitutionally limited to paying CRA as a supplement to people who receive other social security benefits, a job seeker or the pension. So there's actually some constitutional limitations that would have to be overcome if Reform 3 were to be implemented. And there are ways of trying to do that within the Constitution. So using the external powers, external affairs power in the legislation to give effect to the right to an adequate standard of living, which includes housing. One could expand the Australian government's constitutional powers to make provision for housing benefits. One could reform CRA as a Commonwealth state and territory program. And in that case, the Australian government would make grants to the state and territory governments, who would in turn make the payments of CRA to eligible persons. And of course, this is not new, because it's the First Homeowners Grant works in a similar way. So it's something that can be done. Next slide, please. There's also capitalization effects, which I briefly mentioned earlier on in my presentation. And this is more so in relation to Reform 1, because the evidence is not conclusive, but there's been studies in the literature that have raised concerns that if you were to increase rental assistance paid to tenants, which are called demand-side subsidies, then some of this increase might actually be lost in the sense that they're just absorbed in higher market rents. So because if tenants get a higher rate of rent assistance, they might want to increase the consumption of housing, which then might lead landlords to increase rents as a result. So we did try to model what we're calling capitalization effects in the Australian context. It hasn't actually done before, and I have to say that we were quite limited in terms of the data that we have. So we did the best that we can with the Hilda survey that we had, and we found that if there are any capitalization effects, they are actually restricted to severely disadvantaged areas. And in those areas, nearly 1/3 of CRA is shifted into higher rents. We considered why this might be the case, because you don't actually find this happening. We don't see this happening in higher income areas or more generally. And we hypothesized that this could be because of relatively inelastic housing supply in low income areas. So what this means is that if CRA were to be increased and received by CRA recipients in low income areas, and they do increase their consumption of housing, that's going to push up rents because of a lack of housing supply investment in lower value housing market segments. So that's an issue that needs to be considered. I would say that it's more a housing supply issue, and trying to look at improving the supply of housing in more disadvantaged areas would be quite critical from that perspective. This also creates a bit of an issue, because if capitalization effects occur, they affect not just the CRA recipients, but everybody who's living in the area. So there might be some low-income workers, they don't receive CRA, they're living in a disadvantaged area, they'll find their rents going up as well, even though they're not CRA recipients. And of course, all this becomes quite a big issue because tenants in disadvantaged areas face tighter credit constraints. So they're less able to respond to rent increases by saying, oh, I'll just stop being a renter and buy a house. It's just not something that is an option for them. So they can be trapped in a situation where rents start going up, and they're unable to move or make any changes to their housing circumstances to adapt to that. So capitalization effects are a concern, and they definitely need further investigation as well. So next slide, please. And I have come to the end, so I'll just finish by saying that the scope of the project was very much limited to demand-side rental assistance for low-income private renters. And I'm well aware of the fact that there are broader issues, especially around supply-side rent assistance as well, that should be considered. The other thing that I would mention before I end is that we do say that under Reform 3, we would get some savings of around $1.2 billion a year. The report does mention that, and in general, it is the team's view that any savings that are generated from these sort of reforms should be reinvested back into the supply of affordable and social housing that's provided for low to moderate income private renters, whether it's by state and territory governments or community housing organizations. So thank you, and back to you, Tom.
Great. Thanks very much, Rachel. I really appreciate that really clear overview of the research and the report. I'm now going to hand over to Adrian Pisarski to provide some reflection on the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Rachel, for a clear presentation. It's really timely research. At the moment, we, as a council, have just made the decision to have a close look at Commonwealth rent assistance ourselves next year, so this is really helpful in terms of providing some options to look at for reform. I want to begin by acknowledging I'm on Cubby Cubby land, and acknowledging elders past, present, and to also note that the land that we all meet on was never formally ceded. So I guess the other thing to say is that CRA is the largest Commonwealth outlay on housing, so it's a very important issue to look at. We have heard the Commonwealth say repeatedly recently that housing is a state responsibility. I think this goes to show that it's actually a shared responsibility, that the Commonwealth certainly has a role in housing, if not only through CRA, but through its investment in social housing and homelessness programs as well. It's pretty clear from the research that option 3 is the most effective reform of the three. Not only does it target the payment in a much better way, a much more effective way, but it also saves money, which are always things which are attractive to government. I guess the question mark there is that, as you've said, Rachel, it always means taking it off someone to save money, and I think we've seen recently, particularly in the last election campaign, when you promote reforms which are taking things away from people, they tend to get pretty upset and fight rearguard actions against them. So I think that's a real challenge for Reform 3. But from my perspective, I like the fact that it looks at better targeting who rent assistance could go to and not limiting it only to people on benefits, because I think that is a severe limitation. And it also means that it would pick up people who currently don't receive CRA because their income is too low, or the rent that they're paying isn't sufficient to qualify. It would pick them up, and that would be a really good thing. That affects students, for example, and various other people as well. I think one of the challenges would be that some of the people who are receiving it now who would lose it are probably in regional areas where costs are lower. But I really like the fact that for the first time this would also propose looking at the costs that people do pay in different areas and recognising that there are differential costs in places. I think we'd also want to be looking at how else you reform CRA in terms of that variable cost of renting in different places. There's a very different rent from Sydney to Cygnet, even though Hobart, which Cygnet is just outside, is still the least affordable place to rent in Australia based on our rent affordability index that we released this week. But that's more to do with incomes than it is to do with rentals. And I think that's the important equation to look at, is what incomes are people getting and what rents can they afford to pay, and therefore are they in housing stress. Interestingly, when we modelled the job seeker payment through the rental affordability index, and its effective doubling from New Start, which takes single people in particular to just above $20,000 a year, we didn't see any demonstrable impact on lifting those people out of rental stress. So I think it just goes to show how deep the rental crisis is in Australia in terms of the levels of rents that people, particularly singles on those very low incomes, have to pay. So it's a really interesting point. I think it should be possible to broaden the eligibility requirements beyond income support recipients, and I think that would be the most effective way of doing it, actually getting legislative change or constitutional power at the Commonwealth level. I'm a bit dubious about the Commonwealth agreeing to do it through the NAHA or the NAHAR, however we pronounce the acronym these days, and getting states to pay it directly. I can see that there are real benefits in doing that, and that might even force states to top up payments for some of their high cost areas as well, which I think would be a good thing. And it would certainly test the Commonwealth's rhetoric around housing being a state responsibility. It would be consistent with that, so there might be a way of doing it, but I just can't quite see them letting go of that that power of making an income support payment. So I think there are some challenges in terms of option 3. We've had option 1, lifting CRA by 30% as a policy for 15 years, and you know, it's been like banging your head against a brick wall arguing that. They haven't been inclined to lift that, and it looks like they're going to be winding JobSeeker back to its minimum level as soon as they possibly can. The other thing that I think we'd want to look at, and why I think this gives us a great start, is I'm interested in the capitalisation effects that you described, particularly in those low cost markets where you can see an inflationary effect through the demand side subsidy. We've always thought that that was an issue with Commonwealth rent assistance anyway. I know anecdotally people say that it gets, you know, that landlords factor it in low cost markets. And of course it is also captured by community housing providers. So in some ways, whilst it's not paid to landlords, landlords in some parts of the market do capture Commonwealth rent assistance. So there are some complexities there that I think need to be analysed. And we'd also like to look at whether if you just lifted income support levels and got rid of CRA, whether that would counteract some of those things. And I'll just leave us with this last question, Mark, really. We've had CRA since the mid to late 1980s now. It was introduced by the Hawke government. I'm just wondering if it might be an interesting exercise to go back and calculate how much more additional social housing we might have if all of that Commonwealth rent assistance had been spent on additional supply rather than supporting people in the rental market. And I just think that would be an interesting intellectual exercise. It wouldn't necessarily prove anything, but I think it would be good to see the balance between investing in the supply directly and investing in the demand. And I might leave my initial, any comments there, Tom, and hand back to you.
No, thanks, Adrian. So if both of you have your microphones on now, what we're going to do is just run a bit of a Q&A session with you both. So thank you for your presentations. Just a very quick point of clarification first, Rachel. How did you define low-income household in the report?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's a very valid question. I was actually halfway through my presentation and I thought, oh, I forgot to say something about that. I'm sure that's going to come up, so it has. So we did it in a typical way, which was that we took household disposable income and we equivalized them, and then we ranked households from the lowest to highest income, and then we took the bottom 40% as low-income household.
Great, thank you. That's great. A question here is asking around, I mean, you obviously presented 3 different reform options. The question asks, did you also consider in your conclusions and discussion potential blending of those options as a possible policy response?
Yes, I think we did consider that in the conclusion. We didn't actually manage to model combinations of reforms within the time frame that we had, but we did talk a little bit about the benefits of actually combining reforms in the conclusion of our final report. So for instance, we could combine reforms 1 and 3, for instance. So reform 3 would actually generate $1.2 billion of savings a year, and that could then be channeled towards increasing the maximum CRA rate, which is reform 1, for those who are eligible. And that would then offset the cost of just increasing the CRA rate. So yes, so a combination of reforms would, I think, be quite useful to consider.
Adrian, you mentioned in your remarks, I guess, some of those issues that which Rachel also raised about different responsibilities between different levels of government. There's a question here around, I guess, re-engaging the Commonwealth in the social housing sector. Maybe, Adrian, I'll pass over to you first if you've able to share any thoughts about that and how to go about that and what some of the issues are there.
Keep trying, I think, is the answer to that. We certainly, through COVID, through this whole period, ourselves and other housing peaks have been meeting with the Commonwealth ministers on a weekly basis at times, a bit less frequently now, but we've consistently raised the issue of being involved in social housing. We've promoted the Sharp proposal to boost social housing as a stimulus measure. We think there's lots of jobs that can be created in that, as well as the benefits to, and principally for the benefit of providing more social housing. The consistent response we've got is that they see it as a state responsibility. We've now seen the Victorian government do the big build proposal of $5.3 billion. We think that's a really welcome development, and I'm hoping that puts more pressure on the Commonwealth to come back in. I think we need to get other states to follow that lead and to be putting money into social housing, and then really asking the Commonwealth to match it. Probably for 15 years now, we've seen the Commonwealth repeatedly say to the states, we'll give you $1 billion a year and you don't build anything. It ignores the cost of maintaining the system, which they conveniently just dodge all of the time. But I do think it's important to recognise that the Commonwealth has been involved in the provision of social housing since 1946, so it's an over 70-year joint program that has been in existence between the Commonwealth and the states, and we shouldn't, whilst encouraging states to do more, let the Commonwealth off the hook. The Commonwealth does have a responsibility in this area. Commonwealth rent assistance is another way that that's expressed. So I just want to encourage everybody to keep asking, keep making the point that we can do so much more with the Commonwealth in the game than we can with them out of it.
Thanks, Adrian. Rachel, to you now. There's a question here about Aboriginal communities, particularly in remote locations. The question is around these reform options and how you think, or if indeed you looked at, how they may impact social housing in these remote communities. And the question goes on to ask, in terms of households facing new charges for power and water. I don't fully understand the significance of that aspect of the question, but did you look at impacts for remote Aboriginal communities, and what did you see there, if you did?
I'll just try to make some remarks around it. I'm not sure whether it directly answered the question, but we did have a data limitation, so that the HILDA survey was a nationally representative survey, but what that also means is that it's very few Aboriginal households in the survey, because they are a small percentage of the population, and by the time you take it down to the survey sample, you get very small numbers. And coupled with that, I think the question is not just about Aboriginal households, but those that are living in remote areas as well. So there's very small numbers of that as well. So we didn't actually attempt to drill our findings down to that level in our final report, because the findings wouldn't have been robust. But I suppose a general comment that I would make is that the issue of providing adequate housing for Aboriginal households in remote communities is probably not something that reforming the CRA system is going to address in a meaningful manner. I think supply side solutions and investments in infrastructure and that sort of assistance, which would be more around supply side and construction, would probably be, I think, more useful. I just don't see how by reforming CRA we'd actually be able to make much of an impact in that area.
Thanks. I want to ask now about community housing providers. Rachel, you did mention that towards the end of your talk, and obviously this is something of interest to you, Adrian, as well. If I can ask both of you to make some comment on this. Firstly, how many, in terms of the low-income households that you looked at in the report, I mean, how many of them were tenants in community housing? And can you, I guess, reflect a little bit on the interaction between CRA and the community housing sector specifically? And I guess interested in your view on that too, Adrian. But to you first, Rachel.
Yeah, so from the data perspective, we had a very small proportion of we had a very small number of community housing tenants in our sample, but again, it's just because of the fact that it's a national survey. And so most of the findings that we got would largely reflect those who are renting, from real estate agents, at the bulk of the private renters in the market. In terms of the impact that has on our findings, I think one of the things is that rents in the community housing sector is also is capped in a way. So so there may be a large number of, well, it won't be a large number, there will be a number of people whom we say will lose CRA, that will come from the community housing sector. And that's a fact. But then the scope of the project was about CRA recipients, and Reform 3 was about saying, look, if people pay less than 30% of the income in rents, then they shouldn't be getting CRA. And so unfortunately, from that perspective, there will be people who will lose out from the community housing sector. In the report, we do remark on this as well. We are aware of this, and that's why perhaps, there might have to be some consideration of how we might manage the savings so that they might go back into investment in community housing. It's really important that we don't see the so-called savings, disappear into areas that do not actually address issues in housing, especially for low to moderate income groups.
Yeah, Adrian?
Yeah, it's an interesting interaction, the interaction between CRA and community housing. So for the providers themselves, it actually operates as a bit of an operational subsidy because it all gets captured in the rent calculation. From a tenant perspective, especially tenants who are transferring across from public housing where they aren't eligible for CRA, and then they become eligible for CRA moving into community housing, but then all of that additional income is captured. They often find that puzzling and confusing and a bit disconcerting. So it's worth noting that, which is one of the reasons that we look at, would it be better if there was a major increase in income support in general without the kind of segmented nature of the payment that you get now, where you get a payment and then a supplement through CRA instead of a payment of which a proportion is paid in rent for social and community housing. I think that would be much more transparent for tenants. It would, though, drop the income for community housing providers, and community housing providers are really reliant on CRA income for the additional benefit that it provides them, and it's the one thing that allows them to keep head above water in lots of ways. So I think that's an interesting conundrum that would need a lot more thinking about in terms of the proposed reform and how a government might respond. So perhaps some of the savings, if they went for Reform 3, would then have to go in the form of an operational subsidy back to community housing or even to public housing as well. I think this is a very confused area whilst we've got these multiple systems in operation with slightly different rules across systems, and where state housing authorities are providing housing themselves, being a competitor to community housing in a sense, but also their regulator and funder. So it provides, there's a lot of conundrums in the whole provision of social housing that still need to be sorted out, and this is another one of them.
While you were talking, a question's just come in about cooperative housing there as well. Do you want to comment any further on that, or should we just leave that?
Yes, I'm not exactly. I'd have to think about the impact on co-ops.
Yeah, but as you say, there's a range of things that would need to be worked through there. A question for you, Rachel, is in regard, I guess, to social housing waiting lists and whether CRA, to what extent, I guess, there's an overlap, is what I'm sort of reading into this question, between the social housing waiting list and recipients of CRA.
Oh, okay. I'm not so sure that I fully understand the question, so I'll just make some general remarks around it.
I think the question is, are CRA recipients and people on the social housing waiting list, is there a significant overlap between those two categories?
Oh, right. Okay. So, all right. So the national, public housing wait list is standing at about 150,000. So obviously, a lot of these households who are on the public housing wait list would be renting in the private rental sector, and that's just, some of them might be in, transitional housing, or some of them might be on the verge of experiencing homelessness. But then to the extent that those I think some of them are renting in the private rental sector, and so they should. Many of them would actually be eligible for CRA, because to be eligible to get onto the public housing waitlist itself, your income has to be below a certain level, which demonstrates that you're actually of low income status, and a large number of people on the public housing waitlist are also income support payment recipients. So I would expect that a large number of them, the majority of them, would actually be eligible for CRA as well. So of course, in terms of thinking about the reforms again, actually increasing the maximum CRA rate itself would do quite a lot to assist people with coping with housing cost burdens while they're waiting for a public housing property to become available for them.
The other conundrum with that is that if you are in the private rental market and receiving CRA and also on a public housing waiting list, you're unlikely ever to be housed, because the way segmented waiting lists work pretty much right across the country at the moment is that if you're deemed to be adequately housed currently, and most people who are renting would be deemed to be adequately housed, it will exclude you from being offered a place in public housing because the rationing is just so great. So it's another conundrum, and just goes to show we don't have enough supply, we don't have enough CRA, we don't have enough support in the private rental market. And there's also a question to me about the capacity of the private rental market. We have this assumption that there's this ability for the rental market to absorb whoever misses out on social housing, and yet we know that vacancy rates in many, many places in Australia are really low. There just isn't the available supply. It doesn't generate the supply response that I think the economic theories suggest that it should.
Yeah.
Thanks. And also, I'll add some points as well, because just, while we're talking about social housing versus CRA receipt in the private rental sector, because one of the things that these reforms that we've modeled don't directly address is, of course, the issue of security of tenure. So we try to address adequacy and targeting accuracy, but it's still an issue that those who are on low incomes and live in the private rental sector are often subject to very short-term leases, and so and maybe facing great tenure insecurity, which none of these reforms actually address. In some of the other research that we've done, and perhaps others have done as well, but I know some of us have done research for AHURI, we've tried to make suggestions other than expanding the social housing stock, looking at providing some sort of incentives to landlords to offer secure leases to people who are renting in the private rental sector who are actually eligible for public housing. So there are options that are available, and we have modeled them, and there are reforms that are available. But we do need to look at this issue of tenure security, which social housing provides, but the private rental sector will not.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, in your first slide, Rachel, I think it was the first slide, you talked about the international literature review that you'd done, and you indicated that there were some fairly interesting things that you learned through that process, but that time didn't permit you going into those in much more detail than you did. We do have a little bit of time right now, so I'm interested to maybe ask you if you can reflect a bit more on that, if you have anything that you can bring to mind right now, to just sort of talk about, I suppose, what some of the other policy responses are in other countries and how that compares.
Yeah, well, I think some of the major differences are that in many of the countries that we reviewed, there's actually regional variations that are allowed. So in the case of CRA, obviously, we've got this maximum rate and this minimum rent thresholds, which are just standard. They vary by household type, but they don't actually take into account the fact that a lone parent with one child living in Perth would be facing very different housing costs from a lone parent with one child living in Sydney. So I think that's actually an issue that's worth exploring further. Again, there would be some operational challenges if we were to try to redesign CRA reform to take into account differences in housing cost pressures across different cities and regions. But in many other countries, they do allow variations by regional areas or locality. There's also the aspect of rent regulation, which appears to be stricter in countries like Germany, countries like Ireland as well. So in Australia, it's commonly known that rent regulation is fairly light over here. So again, of course, we didn't look at that in our CRA reform designs, but on the aspect of regulating rents, so that they are actually more, so that low-income private renters can actually cope better and have greater certainty about their rent increases would be, I think, a useful reform to consider. In some of the other countries that we reviewed, some of these assistance is actually not just paid to low-income private rental tenants, but also owner-occupiers on low incomes as well. So that's another distinction that we don't have that over here in Australia. So I think those are some of the major differences. And of course, in some countries, they do pay the rent assistance to landlords rather than to the tenants. So those are the major differences, I think.
Do you see that last one, the payment of rental assistance to landlords, as something that has some options for transferability to the Australian context?
Well, in a way, the CRA that's paid to community housing tenants, actually, it kind of goes, yes. It's kind of like a payment. As Adrian said, it's complicated, so I'm just trying to find the right words for the community housing sector. So we do have that in operation, and of course there are pros and cons as well. So as Adrian has brought up, the issue, of course, is that once you reform CRA, and if the CRA is like an important income source for the provider or the landlord, then there are some complexities that we'd have to navigate around. But obviously, that is an option some countries have taken up.
One other question I've got here, again, sorry for you, Rachel, is just, I mean, I know obviously you're relying on the HILDA data as your primary data set for the analysis, but the question is, you know, did that enable you, I guess, to make to observe any findings in relation to specific demographic groups? For example, older women is the one that this questionnaire is interested in.
Okay, so we did do some breakdowns in terms of trying to look at the impacts across different groups, and you know, Reform 3 would have the greatest sort of impact because you're actually taking CRA away from some groups, giving them to others. And as I think I've alluded to in my slides, it would be single people with no children who actually, and younger people living in Sydney and Melbourne, for instance, would actually benefit more out of reforms such as this. I think the issue of older women is a very important one, and we know that they, you know, from all, I don't have to repeat it, from all sorts of angles, they're quite a vulnerable group and at high risk. The shares and at risk of homelessness are growing as well. I think I would just say that the interaction between facing housing vulnerability and aging is quite an important one to consider, and it's even more important when you start looking at the interaction between housing vulnerability, aging, and gender as well, because women typically have lower levels of superannuation savings, etc. The Treasury recently released a retirement income reviews report, and that came out probably about 2 weeks ago, where they did highlight that older renters are a group that are in, you know, high risk of poverty in old age. It is an issue that has been highlighted, and I know that there were a large number of submissions that went into the retirement incomes review that actually highlighted concerns around older renters, older women, which actually did get highlighted in the report itself as well. But unfortunately, I think that's where the report ends. I'm not sure how far it's going to go after that. But the fact is that we have growing numbers of private renters. There are more and more people who don't make it into homeownership and are lifetime renters, and many growing numbers that are dropping out of homeownership as well in later life. And so the group of people who are going to be older and renting is growing, will continue to grow. And it is an issue that is already very important, but it's going to become a really massive issue because of population aging as well. So the issue of not just older women, but all older renters facing housing stress in old age is actually a looming challenge. It's already a challenge. It's going to become an even bigger challenge, which I think the federal government is going to have to cope with, because CRA is a federal payment. So again, going back to the point that housing is not just a state responsibility. It's also going to raise the question in the future of how adequate the age pension rate is actually going to be for our older private renters. So it's going to, the age pension rates make that assumption that most of us, by the time we retire, we're going to own our homes outright. But that's just not, that's increasingly not the typical story of an older Australian retiree anymore.
And you've touched on quite an interesting issue there that I think was covered in, I think it was our second or one of the early webinars that we hosted here, Terry Burke's survey of the rental sector and consideration of its role in the housing system now and going forward. And I think we had some interesting conversation with him and Heather Holst at the time about that. So just in conclusion, I might like to give both of you a chance really just to sort of wrap up and provide some final thoughts and comments, but yeah, I mean, you know, take it however you want, but I guess I'm kind of interested in that question of that sort of, you know, our as we move ahead, and as you say, that the role of the rental sector is growing but also changing. You know, what I guess the future is for the Commonwealth Rent Assistance and this type of policy intervention, is it fit for purpose as we look ahead, and as our housing system continues to undergo change? I'll start with you, Adrian. Do you want to start with some reflection on
Sure.
today's discussion?
I mean, renting is growing as a proportion of tenure amongst all Australians. We know that anybody who is going into retirement and still renting or without home, our whole retirement income system is based on, owning a home outright at the point of retirement, and then you can live reasonably on the pension or with what superannuation you have is. We know that older women are the fastest growing cohort of people becoming homeless, but it's a problem for anybody who's single, retired and renting. Rental costs are horrific. I think CRA needs to be looked at in some way, shape or form, whether it's these reforms or others. It does need to be looked at. And it's because we have a growing push for build to rent. We know that the rental market is really insecure. The solution to that is probably moving away from individual ownership of rental properties to institutional ownership of rental properties, so whether that's through community housing or commercial providers. That is probably also the way to better security of tenure. I think as long as we have individuals chasing capital gain rather than buying properties purposefully to rent to people in a long-term way, I think we're always going to struggle with renting in Australia. We really need to reshape renting, not just CRA. Now, CRA is an important component of that, and how we support low-income households is probably going to be a combination of demand but also supply side measures. I think we need a hell of a lot more supply for the very lowest income households and even the moderate income households, so that we get a decent spread of social and economic mix in there, rather than just housing the most disadvantaged on the lowest incomes. So I think there's a lot of questions. It's a bigger question than just CRA. It's really about how we support renting, whether that's public housing, community housing, private renting, whether institutions are involved in that build to rent through the private sector or however that gets run. Renting needs to be really closely looked at as we go forward.
And Rachel, I'll give you the last word before we close up.
Yeah, look, I think Adrian's made some really good points, and the issue of supporting housing for the low-income groups is actually a much bigger question that extends beyond housing, and it does need an integrated package of housing reforms, hopefully with a mix of demand and supply side measures in them. Just going back to the issue of population aging, it's going to be more and more people who are renting in old age, and a lot of them are actually going to be in need of public housing. So it's not just about looking at improving adequacy in the private rental sector, but improving tenure security for people who are on low incomes in old age. So I think there is quite a strong case for building more social housing. We all know that, and it's an obvious point, and it's important, and it would be quite a forward-looking approach as well. I think if we look at putting into place measures in which we can steadily expand the supply of social housing stock over time, because this is really just a measure to anticipate what the future housing need of a generally older population is going to be in the not too distant future. There's also with regards to housing and social housing as well, again, it's also not just a state issue as well. I mean, if it's probably something that has been talked about, but really it needs to be emphasized a whole lot more. If we just look at studies on social housing and affordable housing and look at how they affect non-housing outcomes, then you'll see that social housing and housing in general is not a state government responsibility, because we know, for instance, that housing can affect people's ability to take up employment opportunities. That relates to the economy in general. So it's not a state level issue. It is a nationwide economic issue that we're talking about here. And I know I'm sort of expanding what I'm talking about into a very, very big picture, but it needs that, because social housing, for instance, has been found by studies to improve children's educational outcomes, because they provide the stability of tenure that we don't find in the private rental sector. And of course, that has important implications as well for children's development, and they are the future workforce of the nation as well. So I think emphasizing the wider importance of housing and affordable housing to the general population, to general well-being of the nation and economy is quite an important narrative that we need to keep taking forward.
Thanks, Rachel. Look, thank you both for your time today and for the insights that you've given us. Also, I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us today on the webinar. I hope you've got a lot out of it. I certainly have. Our next webinar is coming up just next week on Thursday, the 10th of December, which is at 11 o'clock Eastern Daylight Savings Time. We'll be joined by Professor Chris Leishman from the University of Adelaide, and he'll present findings from the AHURI project supporting Australia's housing system, modelling pandemic policy responses. And we'll also be joined on that occasion by Sarah Winter. Sarah is Partner, Commercial Advisory and Impact, Human Services and Community Infrastructure at Deloitte, and she'll be responding to the research and its impact on the sector. That's coming next week, so make sure you book quickly. And finally, our last webinar for the year is going to be just the following Monday after that with Professor Ralph Horn from RMIT, who'll be speaking about the lived experience of COVID-19 housing and household resilience. And I think that's also going to be touching on rental issues, if I'm not wrong. And Emma King from VCOS will be responding to that. So you can register for both of these webinars at the AHURI website. Just a quick reminder in closing that we would appreciate your feedback by completing a short survey that you'll be sent today. And again, if you want to share this webinar with any colleagues or listen again to anything, it will be available on the website soon. So until we see you again in person, thank you once more for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thanks, Tom.